Hello, my name is Laura Bergen. I'm currently a senior research assistant with the Manitoba Indigenous Tuberculosis Photo Project. I was able to visit the Grey Nuns archives in Montreal in August 2021 in order to learn about the St. Boniface Sanatorium, and I'd like to share a little bit about my experiences and what I found. Though the Grey Nuns archive is located in Montreal, they have a collection dedicated to the nuns' work in St. Boniface. A large portion of the collection pertains to the 1960s and later, as the St. Boniface Sanatorium transitioned to the St. Amant Center for Children with Disabilities, though there's also some gems relating to the sanatorium period. I approached the archives with particular questions in mind. Our team wanted to learn all that we could about the experiences of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit patients and staff, but I also was guided by questions regarding how the patients ended up at the hospital, their living arrangements in the hospital, their treatment, and the ways in which the hospital approached the deaths of the patients when they occurred. Through photographs and documents, I was able to uncover some valuable clues into life in the St. Boniface Sanatorium, though the archives also provoked many more questions. A small group of Grey Nuns relocated to St. Boniface from Montreal in 1844 with the goal of educating and caring for the sick. By the 1920s, Manitoba was in the grips of a severe tuberculosis epidemic that was struggling to adequately treat the sick. The Ninette Sanatorium had been accepting the majority of tuberculosis patients for the province. However, the Grey Nuns recognized that the distance to the hospital was too great for many patients to feel comfortable about leaving their families. And since Ninette was a Protestant hospital, the nuns believed that the province needed a Catholic-based institution. After negotiations between Dr. Stewart, the superintendent of Ninette, and the Grey Nuns, the St. Boniface Sanatorium was built on a 60-acre plot of land in 1931. The hospital complex consisted of a main central building that included the majority of the patient beds, an operating room, a laboratory, and a chapel, a power building that contained the laundry and the male staff living quarters, a preventorium for children in a separate building, and a number of outbuildings, including a greenhouse and a garage. By 1934, discussions were ramping up about the prevalence of tuberculosis in Indigenous populations of Manitoba. Though the St. Boniface Sanatorium was not a designated Indian hospital, they were involved in discussions about incorporating tuberculosis surveys and treatment centers on reserves and in residential schools throughout Manitoba. By 1937, the sanatorium was dedicated to expanding their own facilities in order to accommodate Indigenous patients. 1937 and 1938 were pivotal years for the hospital in this regard. The archives hold a collection of letters from this period that debate the financial feasibility of building a separate building on the grounds of the existing hospital to address the increased need. The documentation in this regard is incomplete, however. The hospital ended up building a third floor on top of the preventorium in 1938 as a solution, though there's no conclusive documentation as to why this approach was chosen instead of building a separate building. I suspect that money was the issue, but conclusive evidence is lacking in the Grey Nuns archives. Another question that was provoked by the discovery of the third floor addition to the preventorium was whether or not all the Indigenous patients were housed there. A document written in 1950 on the history of the preventorium, or annex as it was also called, notes that the space housed female patients with, quote, Aboriginal blood. Other documents simply mention that the space housed, quote, Indians, without mention of gender. There also may have been more Indigenous children than adults at the hospital, though there's no concrete evidence to this fact. A letter sent in 1938 suggests that most of the hospital's efforts of combating Indigenous TB should go towards treating children, and that the treatment of adults should be, quote, limited to those who have a decent chance of recovery, end quote, though it's unclear if this plan went forward. However, the number of photographs that appear to show Indigenous children versus adults suggest that it did. The hospital recorded a total of 35 beds for Indigenous patients in its annual report each year between 1938 and 1941. The reports do not record the statistic before or after these dates, However, there is evidence elsewhere that suggests that there were First Nations patients admitted before these dates, and First Nations, Métis, and Inuit patients admitted after these dates as well. The opening of the Dynevor Indian Hospital in Selkirk is cited to have been the cause of the decline in the number of Indigenous patients at the St. Boniface Sanatorium by 1942, as the new hospital was outfitted specifically for the treatment of this population. The photographs and documents at the Grey Nuns Archives provide few details on patient experiences at the hospital, though they do provide a glimpse. The majority of the photographs appear to show Indigenous and non-Indigenous patients interacting with each other. Notably, this is the case in a photograph of a classroom that shows patients in beds lined up in rows where desks typically would be. The hospital school had been put on hold in 1938 when the majority of Indigenous patients were admitted, as the new number of admissions overwhelmed the class. But by 1939, the class had been reinstated, combining all children into a single group. Unfortunately, there's no further information about the school in the Grey Nuns Archives. There are also photos showing children flipping through newspaper comics in what was deemed to be inside recreation, and an occupational therapy program was incorporated in the late 1940s. Christmas activities were also programmed for the children. A photo shows Christmas decorations hanging in the ward, and throughout the hospital's daily records are mentions of holiday celebrations and concerts. The hospital also had its own chapel and held mass on Sundays, where patients were wheeled in on their beds. Religion was a significant element in the St. Boniface Sanatorium, given the Grey Nuns' governance. A key element for the founding of the hospital was to provide a Catholic alternative to the Protestant Ninette Sanatorium. The nuns were hesitant to admit patients that were not already of their faith, but they took the opportunity to educate the patients on the way of Catholicism. The annual reports provide a record of the number of conversions and baptisms that occurred each year. Notably, the daily accounts contain some stories of Indigenous patients converting to Catholicism and being baptized in their final hours. They are portrayed to have converted willingly, though in desperation at a time of suffering and fear. Of course, the archives only provide the nun's perspective, and we cannot know the patient's experiences. There's not much in the archives about daily tuberculosis treatments in the hospital. Rest was important, but there was also a fair amount of surgical procedures performed. There are no anecdotal accounts of these procedures. However, they were recorded in the annual reports. Pneumothorax procedures were by far the most commonly performed. This procedure involved forcing air into the chest cavity to artificially collapse and rest the lung. Thoracoplasties were also performed in large numbers. Similar to the pneumothorax, the thoracoplasty was designed to collapse the tubercular cavities by removing ribs and allowing space for the lung to rest. Other surgical procedures were also recorded, which were not connected to tuberculosis, including tonsillectomies and uterectomies. The 1937 medical department's report suggests that the low death rate from these surgical procedures at the hospital was a feat made possible by having adequate equipment and staff on site, and that the death rate from surgeries would have been much higher if patients had to be transported to a general hospital. Anti-tubercular drug therapy was also incorporated in the late 1940s as they became available. While the Grey Nuns Archives answered some questions, it also left many unanswered questions, and it brought up a few new ones as well. For example, the archives don't tell us what procedures the hospital followed upon the deaths of patients. The 1957 medical department's report briefly mentions that 8 postmortem examinations were performed that year, and there are occasional anecdotes about commemorating the deceased during Sunday Mass, but there's nothing beyond these brief points. Another area of inquiry is the patient's experiences during the 1950 flood. The entire grounds of the hospital was flooded, and patients were sent to other hospitals for over a month, including Ninette and the Bergen Sanatorium. These documents mention the patient's return. However, they're not explicitly clear about whether all patients returned or if some remained at the other hospitals. Overall, the Grey Nuns archives proved to be incredibly valuable to our research as we tried to understand people's experiences with tuberculosis across Manitoba. Though the archives cannot tell us how the patients experienced their hospital stays, they can tell us how the hospital operated and in what conditions the patients were living. I'd like to thank Monsieur Nadeau at the archives for being so gracious and accommodating during my visits. And thank you, viewers, for your interest in our work.